Okay, this is the second video in a three-part series covering negligence, basically. The chapter 9, 10, and 12. Those three are the last three chapters in hospitality law class that I'm going to discuss in this series of videos. But those three chapters primarily are based in negligence theory. In the last video for chapter 9, just discussing your responsibilities as a hospitality operator, I discussed negligence in a little more detail and started touching on some of your specific duties that fall under the duty of care. In this chapter 10, your duties as a hospitality operator to guests. As I mentioned in the first video, the plaintiff has to show that you owed that person, the plaintiff or them, a duty of care. And I explained that you owe a duty of care to guests and to employees, and you do owe a duty of care to non-guests as well, but you don't owe a duty of care necessarily to a trespasser, say, or let's say somebody who doesn't ever enter your establishment. As it relates to, something else, not necessarily like alcohol related laws. We're going to talk about that more specifically in the chapter 12 discussion. But just generally speaking, your duty of care flows just to your guests and to your employees for the most part. So it's important for you to understand who constitutes a guest. Obviously, as we discussed extensively in chapter 7 and 8, I think you have a good idea of who would constitute an employee, but it might be a little bit less clear as to who might constitute as a guest. A guest is basically a customer who is lawfully using your facilities, your food, beverages, lodging, or entertainment services. Notice that that is them using it lawfully, not somebody who's breaking in, stealing, or trespassing. So a guest is exactly that, someone who's considered to lawfully be using your services, your facilities, consuming your food and bev. So that's the general definition of who constitutes a guest, and that's who you owe your duty of care to as it relates to the negligence theory in that first element that I discussed in the video for chapter 9. Now, guests can also be categorized in different ways as well. You have someone who, in the terms of, let's say, hotel specific, somebody who's considered a transient guest versus someone who's considered a tenant. It's good to understand the difference here because each one of those may have statutory protections that the other one doesn't, or similarly, there might be statutory limits on damages that one type can collect versus the other. So a transient guest may only have a certain amount of money that they could collect in a certain circumstance, whereas a tenant might be entitled to sue for more money and more actual damages. So just depending on the state and the statutes, there could be more protections for one or the other, or damage limits that would be paid for the same thing to one over the other. So a transient guest is someone who is staying for a shorter period of time and doesn't have the intention to establish a permanent residency. So that, or occupation. So that could be, think in terms of a hotel typically is a couple of days or even Airbnb. Whereas a tenant does have the intent to establish permanent residency or occupation. So that's more along the lines of renting an apartment or a house. So those are the differences in between transient guest and a tenant, which could still be considered guests that you owe a duty of care to. And again, in hospitality, it's going to be more that you'd be looking at the transient guest. But either way, they're a guest, and as a guest, that means you owe them a duty of care for purposes of negligence discussed in the previous video for chapter 9. Another duty specific to guests that you have to provide, as I mentioned in chapter 9, I listed a few of your duties of care. We're just expounding on that and adding a few more duties, because as I mentioned before, the list that I recited was not exhaustive. There's certainly other duties that you owe. And so we're now going to add the duty to protect guest privacy. Um, you have their guest room privacy in terms of hotels. You have their records. So that could be, let's say, in purposes of a hotel, anything you collect on the guests also for their file when they're coming to stay, or also any customer collection data that you're accumulating for your, let's even restaurant patrons or catering clients, any records that you have about a person that is your guest. You have a duty to protect their privacy, so their guest room privacy, their records, and then also data. You have a duty to protect their data. They use their credit card to pay. Somebody hacks into your system, gets the credit card number, and starts going on a spending spree. You breached your duty of care, assuming that you did something wrong, by not having proper safeguards to protect your guest data privacy. Somebody steals that, you're certainly going to be named in a lawsuit. Notably, in more recent history, you'll know Target was a subject of that, as were several other big retailers. That was a data privacy claim that was brought. And then similarly, I think you've probably heard, or it was certainly a little more recent in the last few years, privacy issues in the guest room context, where somebody was peeking in on a guest's hotel room and seeing them as they were undressing. So you have a duty to protect that guest's privacy in the guest room. And then you, as I mentioned before, have a duty to provide a reasonably safe premises. That is a huge one in hospitality. We have a lot of slip and fall issues, whether it be in hotels, restaurants, bars, breweries, wineries, what have you. The slip and falls are big. We've got liquid that can be on the floor, rain, all kinds of different things that can create slippery conditions. Or something left out that someone could step on or run into. All kinds of different things that could create an unsafe premises. So you have a duty to provide a reasonably safe premises. Ways to mitigate your liability exposure would be to make sure that the premises are well maintained and that you have good operating procedures and policies in place on how to handle certain situations, safely evacuating someone if needed, or guests if needed in general, for fire, or what could possibly go wrong, or policies and procedures going back to the slip and fall and the spill on the floor that I mentioned in the previous video for chapter 9 with regard to a spill at the front entrance of a lobby in a hotel. What are your policies and procedures on handling that? Have very clear policies and procedures to act like a reasonably prudent hospitality operator under the circumstances, as I discussed previously. So now you're seeing it expand a little bit here. So anyway, so those are a little bit more of your specific duties to guests as a hospitality operator.